kind of the heart of the Ozarks. It's by far and away the largest city in the Ozarks. If you're not familiar with the Ozarks, Kansas City and St. Louis, of course, being the biggest cities of the state of Missouri. Springfield's in the southwestern part, and today it's a city of probably metropolitan area, 250,000 people or so. So it's a fairly large city. Still kind of has a reputation of an overgrown cow town. I'll be honest with you. It's been my home, the Springfield area, for my whole life. So we're going to look today at how the Ozarks, how Springfield got started. I always spotlight a famous Ozarker. And today we've got a handsome young lad there who probably is the most famous person to ever come out of Springfield, Missouri. He is well known in the world today. And if you don't recognize him there, you'll probably recognize him here. Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt was a local homegrown actor, went to the University of Missouri, got his start in the movies. He liked just one semester of finishing college and dropped out to become a movie star. And of course, he has become a big movie star, to say the least. Still making movies, still making those dollar bills. On occasion, you can see Brad Pitt in Springfield. He'll make a kind of secretive little trip back, and his family still lives here, and he comes back quite often to visit with his family. So that's our famous Ozarker of the day. So let's get to talking about the history of Springfield. Now, the earliest settlers around the area, as we now know as Springfield, came here about 1822. And they were a little more than mountain men. They just, they lived in log cabins, they hunted, they fished, they led just subsistent lives. Very, very early. You remember when we talked about Mr. Schoolcraft coming into the Ozarks in 1818, 1819. He did stay with some people that, he really described as little more than, well, hardly even human, So there were people here very early in the 1820s. Some of those pioneer families, if you're from this area, you probably recognize some of these names: Pettijohn, Patterson, Ingle, Rice, Friend. These were some of the very earliest settlers in the Springfield area as we know it, mostly around the James and the Findlay River. There was also the Wilson, which he eventually gave his name to the creek that lay where the Battle of Wilson's Creek was fought in 1861. A man by the name of Gillis, Philibert, Pearson. These are all really common names in the Springfield area and have given their name, at least some of them have, to different features in the Springfield area, like Pearson Creek and Wilson Creek. So here's a marker that was put up by the Rotary Club, or pardon me, the Sons of the Revolution in 1921. It said 460 feet due west is the site of the first claim located in what is now Greene County by John Pettijohn, about 1818. First settlement made here by Thomas Patterson, August 1822. Also site of the Muncie Indian Village under Chief Sandwick. So you can see these markers all over the area around Springfield and Greene County. The University Club, the Rotary Club, the Sons of the Revolution put up several of these markers of historic sites, and they're still, most of them are still present. So who was the founder of Springfield? Well, that name is usually given to John Polk Campbell. And if you are familiar with Springfield, of course, you're probably familiar with Campbell Street, which is one of the main north-south thoroughfares in the city. John Polk Campbell arrived in the Springfield area about 1829, and he is almost generally considered to be the founder of the city. He was born and raised in North Carolina, around Mecklenburg, and he had quite a pedigree. He wasn't just some rough mountain man like a lot of early settlers in the Ozarks. He was first cousin to the future president, James K. Polk, and he was actually raised in the home of Revolutionary War hero Nathaniel Greene, and that's the name of the county Springfield is located in Greene County, and it was named after, Nathaniel Greene. So he has quite a pedigree. He wasn't, like I said, just some simple mountain man. Moved to Columbia, Tennessee, after he got married. And in 1828, he was visiting some of his Polk relatives that lived in North Arkansas, and they decided to go on a hunting trip. And so they ventured up into southern Missouri, and he happened upon the present day, what we call Jordan Creek, which runs right in the middle of Springfield, starts right down by the square. And he found this natural spring, and he thought, man, this would make a beautiful homestead. It was wilderness then, there wasn't anything around it. So he carved his initials on an ash tree, returned to Tennessee to bring his family back to the new homestead the next year. Got back the next year, and he found another family had already arrived ahead of him and had actually taken up his claim. They had built a cabin. He and several of his members of the family, they actually had more than one cabin. And Campbell and him got into a little argument about it, and Campbell showed him the initials on the ash tree, and Fulbright relinquished his claim. He said, "You're right, it's yours. I'll move on." And he moved further west into what we now call the College Street, Mount Vernon Street area, if you're, again, familiar with Springfield. And again, the Fulbright name is a very common name in Springfield. Fulbright Springs. There's several different things named after him. A school is named after him. So this is John Polk Campbell and his wife. That's also his little baby daughter, which I don't know if this is the same one, but his daughter, he had a daughter that was born here the second year he lived here. And she is the first female to be born, actually the first child to be born in Springfield. So that's John Polk Campbell and his wife. Here's a marker at a place called Founders Park in the square of Springfield. And it says the natural well 55 feet north of this point calls the location. John Polk Campbell founded, and I'm really having a hard time reading this because it's broken up. And the settlement in 1830 of what is now Springfield, marker erected in 1921 by the Rotary Club of Springfield. So it's another one of those things. They built a park right north of the square called Founders Park, and it kind of is dedicated to the founding of the city of Springfield. Eventually, he built a big two-story house in South Springfield. There's south of the city, actually, at that time, located near what is now known as Jarrett Junior High. They eventually moved the house in the 1920s to build the junior high, and now it's gone. But you can see this house would have been built sometime in the 1860s, 70s. You can see that this was a pretty substantial house for that period of time. So John Polk Campbell was not just some simple country bumpkin. And I've said he was a man of wealth, he was a man of means, and he had quite a pedigree. So there were some other Springfieldians that came with Fulbright and Campbell. They settled around the same area. They settled around the square, what we now know as the square, or down on what we now know as College Street. John Roundtree was one of these. And again, this is a name that's very familiar in the Springfield area. To the east of the square, there's a Roundtree School right near Missouri State University in the Roundtree neighborhood. He settled eventually in West Mount Vernon Street, but then moved over into the east side. He was the first teacher. He established the first school. It said that he had a library that he had inherited from his father that had come from England. I'm sure his library was just a few books, but in that day and time, that was quite the library. So there were other settlers begin to move into what is becoming Springfield now. This settlement, this early settlement, hadn't been named yet. It had been incorporated, but it was beginning to attract more settlers because of the favorable location. You had the Ingrams, you had the Millers, you had the Slavins, the Burnetts, and the Painters. And again, these are all very familiar names that still linger in the Springfield area. If you've been around Springfield very much, you've probably heard these names one time or the other. Another one of these markers, the Fulbright marker, said about February 1830, William Fulbright erected near this spot the first cabin built on the site of the present city of Springfield. At the same time, A.J. Burnett built a pole cabin near the natural well, and John Fulbright another near Jones Spring. First church service was held in the first church, the Methodist Church, organized in the cabin of William Fulbright. This street was originally named Fulbright, and the settlement was called Campbell and Fulbright Springs. University Club Historical Marker, number 15, June 1929. So here's Mr. Roundtree, another one of these. He's the first teacher, and this would have been taken probably in the 1870s, 1880s, when he was a very old man at that point. So when was Greene County established in the city of Springfield? Well, in 1833, the Missouri State Legislature carved out Greene County out of Crawford County, which is up around, today Crawford County is up around Cuba, Missouri, on the way to St. Louis. Now, at that time, Greene County included the whole of Southwest Missouri. It was a huge county. Of course, eventually other counties were broken off of it, and they became other counties, which was very typical. There was a little dispute about what was going to be the county seat, and that was a big deal back in these days, still is a big deal. But there was a man by the name of Josiah Danforth that is settled east of Springfield, probably about 8 to 10 miles. And that Danforth farm, by the way, is still existing today. If you're familiar with the Rogersville area, the Webster County area, you know that the Danforth farm still exists today. And Danforth, again, is one of those big names in the state of Missouri. And Josiah Danforth wanted the county seat to be located at his farm. But apparently John Pope Campbell had a little bit more pull at that point, and he was able to get the Missouri State Legislature to name the county seat at his village, his settlement. At that point, it was called Fulbright or Campbell Springs. It depended. There had not been a real name strategically or legally placed on the settlement, but everybody called it Fulbright Springs or Campbell Springs. I guess depending on which side of the family you fell on. There was still probably a little bit of a resentment going on there between the Fulbright and the Campbell families. Some assume Campbell named the new town because he often talked about his property as having a spring under the field. There was this natural spring that flowed up under his field, and it watered all his property. And so he often talked about his spring under the field. There's another theory that James Wilson, who was even earlier than Campbell in the area, named the town after his hometown of Springfield, Massachusetts. And then there's a third theory, and this is the one that most people kind of fall down upon. There is a popular story that in 1836, there was a contest held to name the new settlement. It had become the county seat, and it really hadn't been incorporated. It didn't have a name. So they had a contest, and Kindred Rose, who came from Springfield, Tennessee, decided he wanted the town named after his town, his hometown. And so he set up a table in the middle of what we now know as the square, and where they were voting. And the story goes, he gave out a jug of liquor to everybody that would vote for his name of his property, and it won. Go figure, okay? So Kindred Rose is usually the man that is given the tribute of naming the city of Springfield after his hometown of Springfield, Tennessee. So here's Greene County. As you can see, it's a huge county, incorporated almost all of Southwest Missouri at that point in time. And Springfield would have been located about right here, right between the two E's. This is a map of Greene County in 1834. As you can see, there's a lot of counties along the Mississippi River boundary and a lot along the Missouri River. but there's not too many out here and not a whole lot up in the northern part even. Okay, so at that point, the village begins to grow. Now, since John Polk Campbell is kind of the mover and shaker of this new community called Springfield, he decides it needs a proper square. You know, every county seat's supposed to have a square. So he donates 50 acres of his land to build a new square. He laid out the settlement, he laid out lots, he laid out streets and alleys. And he said, this is where the new square is going to be, and we'll build a courthouse on this square. It was kind of laid out in an unusual fashion. If you're familiar with small town squares, and I'm sure some of you are, you know that most of the squares, most of the streets come in on the corners, and the courthouse sits in the middle of the square. That's not the way Springfield Square is laid out. Springfield Square is laid out with the four streets coming in at the clock positions, 12, 3, 6, and 9. I'll show you a picture here in a minute of the Columbia, the Columbia, Tennessee Square, where John Polk Campbell came from. And he laid it out just like his hometown of Columbia, Tennessee. And it's rather an unusual fashion. There's other squares besides Springfield and Columbia, Tennessee, but not many of them have this configuration. Like I said, I'll show you a picture in a minute so you can get a better idea. Mr. Ingram, who was one of these original settlers, and he ran a logging operation. He built the first courthouse. It was a 2-story log cabin. Someone said it looked more like a chicken coop, than a courthouse. We don't have any photographs of it, so we don't know what it looked like, but apparently it wasn't really impressive. If you're familiar with Springfield, you probably know where the Hers building sits. Well, that would have been where the Springfield Courthouse sat, on that corner right there. The first businesses to line the new square were a dry goods store and grocery stores owned by the Berry and the Fulbright and the Ingram families again. John Carter and John Ball owned a blacksmith shop. And of course, John Campbell, being the mover and shaker of the town, he had a hotel. So he built a hotel on the square. There was also a gunsmith store right off the square on what is now known as Olive Street. And Jacob Painter became a huge name in the Old West as far as gunsmiths. A lot of the old gunfighters and a lot of the early West people that we hear about actually carried what was called Jake's Best guns. He was a huge gunsmith, and his guns were considered some of the most reliable and some of the best guns ever produced in the Old West, and they still exist. And I'll show you a picture here in a minute. Okay, this is the Columbia, Tennessee aerial view of their square where John Polk Campbell came from. And you can see that instead of coming in on the corners, like most streets do at the square with the courthouse in the center, the streets come in at the clock positions, 12, 3, 6, and 9. And that's exactly how Springfield Square is laid out. This would be, if you were familiar with Springfield, this would be College Street, named because the first school was located there, College Street. This is Boonville, which was the road to Boonville, Missouri. This is St. Louis Street, which obviously was the road to St. Louis, Missouri. And this was South Street because, well, it headed south. Not very innovative, to say the least, but at least it's there. So this is kind of give you a configuration of the square in Springfield. This is the earliest view of Springfield that we have. This would have been about 1850. If you're familiar with the square in Springfield, you would be looking at a position northeast of the square from about what we call the top of the Hers building. These would have been these earliest settlements out in this area through here. These were said to be slave cabins that belonged to some of the early settlers. Many of these early settlers were slave owners. And so this would have been the earliest photographic view of what we now know as Springfield, the downtown area, looking from the square. This is the earliest view of the square that I have. It's about 1859, right before the Civil War. And again, you would have been looking at about the northwest corner of the square. This is where the HERS building presently sits, and this is the state office building, if you're familiar with, the Springfield Square. And so this is a very, very early photograph. This is a little bit later. This is beginning to show you kind of the idea of the square as we know it today. This is College Street. Boonville goes off here. This would have been St. Louis Street here, and South Street would have gone off this way. And this was the courthouse. This was the second courthouse. This was a brick affair, and it was much more stable and much more prosperous looking. This is a dry goods store, one of those dry goods stores that probably had been built up from the very earliest times. So you can see this would have been about 1870 or so. So this would have been, the square would have really been taking off at this point in time. So that kind of gives you an idea of the rest of the center part of Springfield. This is an exhibit. If you were to go to the History Museum on the downtown square in Springfield, this is the painter's guns. And these are some of the guns that he built. He built rifles, he built pistols. He was a prolific gunsmith. Guns are still noted for being some of the most well-known guns in the Old West. Okay, so what happens after Springfield becomes a county seat? Well, it's incorporated and it finally becomes a legal city. It was already a city, but or a village, but it was finally incorporated and incorporation papers and becomes the whole deal at that point. By 1840, Springfield had a population of about 300 people, pretty good sized little community for the 1840s. About a third of those were slaves. So again, several members of the original families that settled Springfield, being from Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, they would have brought their slaves with them. Now, we're going to deal with the Black population in the Ozarks next week. And as you'll find out, there were not a lot of slaves in the Ozarks in general. Springfield is the exception because it is the bigger village of the area. It does have a fairly substantial slave population, but it's the only area really. During the 1840s, many firsts for Springfield took place. The first classical academy was built. That's the school. The first bank was established. The first newspaper, the Ozark Standard, was started in 1837 and went ahead and became the Ozarks Advertiser and eventually the Daily News and the Leader and Press and so forth until you have the present newspaper today. 1850, Springfield had grown to over 500 citizens. So it had grown quite substantially. In a period of 10 years, it had almost doubled. The Butterfield stage line had arrived. That's a huge deal, folks. The Butterfield stage line was the first express stage line to go west, and it started in Tipton, Missouri, and ended up in California. And it had a station on the square in Springfield. It would come in and, change its horses. People maybe would stay overnight, get a meal, clean the stage up, and go on. By the way, there's a little town called Butterfield south of Springfield, southwest of Springfield, near a little town of Cassville, Missouri. You might be familiar with it if you're from this area. There were more classical academies established. Springfield started to get a reputation as an educational center. Still does, folks. There's, I'm counting right now, there's 4 major higher education institutions in the city of Springfield right now. Missouri State University, Drury University, Evangel University, and then there's Ozark Technical College, which is a junior college. There's lots of other smaller colleges and all, but that's the three major ones or four major ones. And it's always had this reputation as an educational kind of center of the Ozarks. The first legal hanging took place in the 1850s. There had been other hangings, again, not untypical of small towns. Stone courthouse, brick and stone courthouse replaced the old original log structure. I'd show you a picture of that a few moments ago. And they had started a fair. And again, fairs are big deals. Fairs where all the farmers would bring their goods in to show them off. And this was a big deal because if you had good products and people wanted to buy them, that has continued on till the day of the Ozark Empire Fair, which is probably second only to the State Fair in Sedalia, is the biggest fair in the state of Missouri. So it was kind of one of these things that got started in the 1850s. This is Mr. Butterfield, and this is one of his original stagecoaches. As you can see, it would not have been a really comfortable place, particularly if you happen to ride up here in the jump seat or up on top. These stages carried a lot of people. You had to pay extra to be inside. And so if you didn't have enough money, you either got to ride up here and eat the dust, or even worse, ride up on top of the coach and hang on. It was not the most glamorous thing, to say the least, but it was an efficient way to get, to the west. This is another photograph of the courthouse. This, I think, would have been the third courthouse that was built on the square. I believe this is not the same one I showed you the picture of earlier. I think this is the third one. It eventually burns, and they decide to move the square north, the courthouse north of the square. We'll talk about that later because Springfield gets into a rivalry with an adjoining community called North Springfield, centered around Commercial Street. It all occurred because of the railroad coming to town. And we'll talk about that later in another presentation. There were other firsts in the 1850s and 30s and 40s. The first white male child was Harvey Fulbright, born in 1831. The first female child was Mary Frances Campbell. And she plays a part later on in the history of Springfield. She's involved in the Civil War. And she remains in Springfield when the war is going on. John Pope Campbell and most of the males left because, again, they were slaveholders. They would have been Southern sympathizers. Mary Frances stayed and kept the house going. His wife had died by that time. And John Pope Campbell, his daughter, as I said, kept the house going during the war. And again, there was this kind of chivalrous thing between the wars. The soldiers would not normally bother females and children. Even if they were of the opposing side, they might steal their cattle, they might take their chickens, they might take all their food, but they normally didn't bother the women and children. Now, that wasn't the case with the guerrilla fighters, and we'll find out about that when we go to the Civil War in a couple of weeks. The first death was a man by the name of Joseph Miller in 1831. So wasn't too long after the village was founded, somebody died. The first marriage was Lawson Fulbright and a female by the name of Roper. And she was followed by the marriage of a girl by the name of Miller and to Junius Roundtree. So you can see all these names are kind of familiar if you're around the Springfield area. The first church was built in 1833, and it was occupied by both the Methodists and the Presbyterians. Again, this was not unusual. Probably didn't have enough money and enough members to build their own church, so they would split it. Methodists would probably take one time, the Presbyterians another. The first frame house, not log cabin, was built by Canifax in 1836. So it's 6 years before you have an actual house built in Springfield. Other than that, they were log cabins. The first post office was built in 1834, and the first postmaster was a brother of John Pope Campbell, a man by the name of Junius Campbell. Social life, there wasn't a lot. Everybody worked. What there was centered around camp meetings, political discussions, dancing, There's a lot of dancing, hunting, picnicking. There just wasn't a lot to amuse the people as such. The one exception was dram shops. Now, you may not know what a dram shop is, but a dram shop is no term that comes from England, and we call it a saloon today. And they sold whiskey, and they sold a lot of it. Apparently, the early settlers of Springfield area were big whiskey drinkers. Remember, most of them were Scots-Irish, and they brought with them their affinity for the spirits. I'm from an old Scots-Irish family, and I can guarantee you that my ancestors liked their liquor. Okay. I myself have always kind of avoided it, but not so my ancestors. This in turn led to violence. Since there was so much liquor involved, there was probably some violence that occurred. The first killing in Springfield occurred in 1836, happened when the judge, a man by the name of Charles Yancey, encountered a man by the name of John Roberts, who was drunk and had an issue with the judge over a legal issue. And they got into an argument, and Roberts started to pull his gun on him, and Yancey pulled one on him and shot and killed him. First homicide in Springfield. By the way, Yancey was declared as innocent, obviously self-defense. 1838 was the second one, man by the name of Randolph Britt. He killed a man by the name of Joseph Reno. He was convicted of manslaughter. So he was charged and convicted, but no one knows for sure what happened. I understand that he was pardoned by the governor for whatever reason. In 1841, the third murder in Springfield took place when Mr. Davis was killed by a man by the name of John Shanks. Shanks had never went to trial because he apparently escaped jail and disappeared. So, there were a lot of issues. Springfield is growing in a reputation as kind of a rugged little community. Most people don't realize that after the Civil War, Springfield was kind of the prototype of the old West towns. We'll talk about Wild Bill Hickok. Wild Bill Hickok actually gained his reputation in Springfield as a gunfighter. And so, Springfield becomes kind of a prototype of the old West town long before Dodge City and some of these cities. In reaction to all this, there were revivals. The preachers, of course, were upset with all this drinking and all this killing. And so they decided they were going to have revivals. And apparently, during the Third Great Awakening, which occurred in the 1850s, Springfield went dry for a while. They said that all the shops closed up. There's a story that one of the biggest and most famous that was located on the square, that in full view of the preachers and all the people that were against the liquor, brought all of his liquor out and broke all the jugs on the street, and everybody applauded him and said how great it was. And that lasted for about 3 days. And then he went back to selling more liquor. But at least there was an attempt to go in dry. Now, this is the first house that still exists in Springfield today. This is the Gray Campbell house. This was not John Pope Campbell's house. He owned it, but it lay in South Springfield around the intersection of what we now know as Republic Road and the James River Freeway. When they decided to build that road in the 1970s or 80s, the James River Freeway, someone said, hey, that's one of the oldest houses in this area. And they got to researching, found out who owned it and, where it came from. And indeed, it is considered to be the oldest house still standing in Springfield. They moved it into what is now known as the Nathaniel Green Park along Scenic Street in southwestern Springfield. And they have set up kind of a little village there. And they actually have weekends where you can go and tour the house, and kind of a reenactment of Springfield in the 1850s. In fact, I think next weekend The third weekend in September is when they have the big doings over at the Nathaniel Green Park, where they actually have a lot of activities and a lot of displays going on at the Gray Campbell House. Pardon me, this is the oldest brick house in Springfield. It still stands on South Street, and you can tell it was probably a Greek revival, probably built in the 1870s. And it still stands. I believe it's now an architectural firm. I may be wrong on that. I know it was for a while. It's called the Day House. Still stands there. So this is the oldest brick house in Springfield. I have a really short little film here on the Gray Campbell homestead. I thought you might be interested because it's not untypical of what a lot of our ancestors lived. And so I thought you might be interested in seeing. This is about a 5-minute long film, and this will be the end of it then.
The small white house in front of you is the oldest house in Springfield. James Price Gray built this 2-room farmhouse in 1856. Gray's sister Susan married John Polk Campbell, namesake and nephew of Springfield's founder. They later lived in this house. For almost 100 years, someone from the Campbell family lived in this house until it became vacant in the 1950s. The Gray Campbell House was moved to this site in 1984. It was discovered during construction of the James River Freeway near the intersection with Kansas Expressway about 2 miles south of here. Gray came to Missouri from Tennessee. This house reflects the taste and quality of the period and reveals some Southern architectural influence with a variety of Greek Revival style features seen inside. The house has 2 front doors and 2 windows for each room. Fireplaces on each end of the house provided the only sources of heat in the winter. The doors with long uninterrupted panels are somewhat short and wide compared to modern era doors. The simulated columns on the fireplace mantel are an example of the Greek Revival style. The 9/6 windows are another Greek Revival touch. This room on the south or nearest you is the living area. The family would take their meals here, and as small as it is, spend much of their indoor time in this room, except when sleeping, of course. The table is set with dishes showing various patterns from the Civil War era. Pieces and fragments of dishes and tableware were found during the archaeological excavation at the original site. Glass and metal items from different periods were found at the excavation site, and some of those are displayed here, including various buttons made of wood, bone, glass, metal, and even gutta percha, a type of hard rubber. The yarn winder or weasel and the Boston rocker were often present in Civil War era homes. Photographs on the walls are from the Civil War era as well. Genealogical charts further illustrate family history. The random width tongue and groove floor is made of pine from the Pacific Northwest, as is the exterior siding. Underneath the floor, there are heavy hand-hewn logs which rest on a plate on the limestone foundation. The door between the 2 rooms has a Bennington-type pottery knob. The north room is the bedroom. It has 2 rope beds with straw ticks and feather mattresses. A trundle bed for children is kept underneath one bed, and the all-important chamber pot rests under the other. An open baby trundle bed displays a christening dress. A ceramic pitcher and bowl used for washing rests on a wooden cabinet between the 2 beds. Water would have been hauled from either a spring or, in this case, a well. A family Bible, quite possibly the only book a family would own, lies next to a pair of spectacles or eyeglasses. Closets on either side of the fireplace hold adult and children's clothing. While looking at this small room, approximately 16 feet by 16 feet, try to imagine a large family sleeping in an area of this size. Both the Grays and the Campbells had large families. The large loom was used to make rag rugs as seen on the floor in both rooms. The 1856 Singer sewing machine is an early indication of the self-sufficiency required. Making clothing for a large farm family would be a prime chore for the mother of this era. The dresser tops feature personal artifacts, such as a bone comb and daguerreotypes, an early form of photographic printing in the mid-19th century. This portable foot warmer is the 19th century method for keeping feet warm on those cold Missouri days, whether weaving or sewing by a cold and drafty window or out for a buggy ride. Simply remove a hot coal from the fire, put it in the metal warming tray, and take it with you. By now, it should be obvious that the two-room house does not include a kitchen. Most homes of the time had a detached kitchen to reduce the danger of fire in the house and to simply keep the heat from the cooking fires out of the living areas during the hot summertime. The kitchen in this case is behind the house to the west or your left. This log structure was brought here from Hurley, Missouri, several miles southwest of Springfield. The formed rocks for the chimney came from McClurg, Missouri. On one side of the kitchen's fireplace is a dry sink holding pails, dippers, and pans, and a table on the other. Kitchen and fireplace utensils hang throughout. North of the kitchen is a granary, which was brought here from Diggins, Missouri, which is about 25 miles east of Springfield. Today, the granary is used to store pots, pans, and items such as a cider press, butter press, and sausage press used in demonstrations and at special events at the farmstead. To the northeast of the house is the privy or outhouse, located there no doubt due to the direction of the prevailing winds. To your left, south of the house, is the two-crib barn. Farm implements from the period such as plows, harrow, hoes, choppers, a rake, and a scythe are stored here. To keep the tools sharp, there is a foot-driven sharpening stone. A foot-operated shaving block is also kept, along with a drawing knife and rope-making boards. Remember the rope beds we saw inside the house, one of the many uses of rope on the farm. The Springfield Farm Wagon, built in Springfield, Missouri, sets between the two cribs for loading and unloading. Looking beyond the house to the north, we can partially see the cemetery. While this is not the actual burial ground of the Gray or Campbell families, it is indicative of the fact that in the mid-19th century, people often were born, lived, and were buried on the same farm. Some of the headstones and the unusual stone box burials were moved here from the original location at the family's request. Headstones for Elijah Gray and his wife, parents of James Price Gray, builder of the house, and other Gray children are present in the cemetery. This recreated farmstead on the Kickapoo Prairie is the last surviving farmstead, depicting a Civil War era lifestyle of the early settlers in this area in southwest Missouri. This modest but well-designed house is a good example of a typical farm home of the mid-19th century. You can watch it come alive during some of the annual celebrations that take place here at Nathaniel Green Park to celebrate Ozarks history, heritage, and culture. Sheep and Wool Days is held on the second Sunday in June, 1 to 4:30 p.m. The 1860 Lifestyle Exhibition is held on the third Saturday and Sunday in September. The house is open Saturday and Sunday, 1:30 to 4:30 p.m., May through September. It is open only on Sundays in April and October.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that. If you're like me, you probably can remember a little things like that. Our parents or grandparents, who knows, maybe some of you out there lived in places like that. Next week, we're going to talk about the African American experience in the Ozarks. Again, there weren't a lot of slaves or blacks in the Ozarks after the Civil War, but there was substantial enough that they deserve to be talked about. And it's a bittersweet experience. There were some good things that happened. There were some extremely violent things that happened. I think we need to hear it because, again, it's part of history. So we'll talk about that next week. So I hope you enjoyed today. Hope you've learned a little something, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Donna. We'll see y'all.
Okay.
That's good.